Hi, good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Right, so I'm not used to that reaction at a secondary school, but I'm going to introduce you to a gentleman, Martin Stern, okay? He was a doctor, but when he was your age, that's a little bit younger, he had an experience he'd like to share with you, because from this experience there's lots of lessons that we can learn. Okay, so I'm going to hand you over to Martin for the next half an hour. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Lee. Well, thank you all for coming. As you heard, I'm Martin. I was a doctor until 11 years ago. I'm retired. But once upon a time, I was a child. When I was 5 years old, I lived in Holland, in Amsterdam. And there were nasty people who had taken over Amsterdam and Holland and tried to do some very nasty things. I was at a little school. When we were 5 years old in those days, we didn't learn reading and writing or anything fancy like that. We just sang songs and played games and folded paper. And my teacher had taken my class into the little school hall. It was much smaller than this one. And she was sitting on a chair behind a table on the little stage. And she had told us to line up against the side wall. There were probably only about 20 of us. And two young men walked into the back of the hall and said, "Is Martin Stern here?" And the teacher immediately said, "No, he hasn't come in today." And there I was, standing in the middle of the road with my classmates. And I didn't understand what was going on. So I put my hand up and I said, "But I am here." And one of those two young men took me by the shoulder and started leading me out of that hall. And I looked back over my shoulder at the teacher, and I'll never forget the terrible expression on her face. They took me outside. It was a drizzly day. They had bikes leaning against the lamppost. And you know, in Holland, people carry other people on the backs of bikes all the time. And they put me on the back of one of those bikes, and off these two young men walked, cycled with me through Amsterdam. And they were talking with me all the way, and they were talking Dutch. And their Dutch was absolutely perfect. So I knew they were Dutchmen. They weren't people who had learnt Dutch, because Holland had been taken over by the Germans and the Austrians, by people called Nazis, who were doing an awful lot of terrible, nasty things. And I knew they weren't Germans and Austrians. They were Dutch people who were helping the nasty people. Well, we arrived at a big red brick building. It was a school before, but the Nazis had thrown all the pupils out and all the teachers, emptied the building, and they used it for questioning people. They arrested people and they brought them there to ask them questions. And I was led into a large office, and in the middle of the large office was a huge desk, and behind the desk sat a rather fat man in a military kind of uniform who started asking me questions. But I was asking some questions too. When can I go back to school? When can I go home? And the man sat back in his chair and he said, that was not part of his job. His job was just to find out if I was Martin Stern. And if I was not Martin Stern that he was looking for. And I think that man knew exactly what he was happening with. Well, when he was satisfied, he caught the right little boy. He ordered another man to take me out of there. And I was taken into the corridor, the school corridor, lots of doors, all shut. But one of the doors wasn't shut. One of the doors was open. And as I was led past this one classroom with an open door, I could see into it. And there was a man standing there with his back to me. And I knew him. I had been living with him and his wife for nearly 2 years. So I called out to him. And normally I'd have run up to him to give him a hug, because this man and his wife had been just like my mummy and daddy and been very nice to me. And I loved them. But the Nazis just dragged me away. All they wanted was that I, a 5-year-old little boy, should call out to him so that they would know that I knew him, I could recognize him from behind, so that he couldn't say that he hadn't been looking after him and that he didn't know me. Because my father was Jewish, and the Nazis were trying to kill all the Jewish people. And this man and his wife had looked after me to try and make sure that I wouldn't be killed. Well, how did we get to that situation? My dad was Jewish. He was born in Germany, in a place called Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany. And he was born more than 100 years ago, my daddy, in 1911. And his daddy, my granddad, owned a factory which made ladies' coats and ladies' dresses. And they sold those coats and those dresses in the capital of Berlin, in Germany, Berlin, and they sold them all over Europe. It was a very big factory, it was a very successful factory. And my grandma and my granddad were very rich. They lived in a beautiful big house in the countryside near Berlin. They had a huge garden. They had famous paintings on their walls. They had lots of antiques in their house. And they were trying to be good German citizens. They gave their sons German names. My dad was called Rudolf. And Rudolf isn't just the name of Rudolf the red-nosed reindeer. It's a very common boy's or man's name in Germany. And so my grandparents had given my daddy a very German name. Now, my daddy was only 3 years old when Germany got involved in a war called the First World War. And you'll probably see a lot on the television about the First World War in the next few years, because it started 100 years ago, and people are putting a lot of programs out about it on the television. But my daddy was only 3 when it started. But he had an older brother who was a soldier in the German army in the First World War. He may have killed British soldiers for all I know. And one of the stories I've been told about my uncle, my father's older brother, is that when he came home as a soldier, when he came home on leave from fighting against the British and the French and the Americans, one of the first things he would do was to take his little kid brother, my dad would know this, into the garden and show him how to dig a trench. Because in the First World War, what people did was they dug holes in the ground, trenches, and they hid in those trenches until they suddenly jump out and try to run across to capture the other side. And if people were running towards them, they would shoot from the trenches, and of course they were protected because their bodies were below the ground in the trench. So trenches were very important in fighting in the First World War. Well, a lot of nasty things happened in Germany, and Germany was in terrible trouble. And people were looking for somebody to blame. And in Germany and in many other countries, there had been a lot of discrimination against people who were Jewish and against other people who were not considered to be proper Germans. And so the Germans started blaming the Jewish people for them losing the First World War, even though the Jews, like my uncle and like my grandparents, had done what they could to help Germany win. But that didn't make any difference. They were blamed for Germany losing the war. And so the Germans elected people to become the government who were called Nazis. And the Nazis said to the Germans, all we need to do is get rid of the Jews and some other people. We need to get rid of the gypsies, and we need to get rid of people who are gay, and we need to get hold of the people who are in charge of trade unions and who don't like the Nazis, and anybody else the Nazis didn't like. And if we imprison them and kill them, then everything will become wonderful. And so Jewish people had to escape from Germany, and a lot of my family escaped from Germany. My father's sister went to live in Manchester, but not all my family could get out, and my father got left behind in Germany. And he met a young woman. My dad was a young architect, and this young lady was also an architect. And they became friends. She was also very much against the Nazis. She did an incredibly brave thing. She was traveling in a very, very crowded train when the Nazis were the government in Germany. And she was carrying a little suitcase. And she was elbowing her way through the crowd in the gangway, trying to get to a seat, perhaps. And the catch came on the suitcase, and the lid flew open. So what do you think happened? Any idea? That's right. All the things in the suitcase spilled all over the floor. Now, what do you think was in her suitcase? Yes? Architects' things. It could have been. That's a very good guess. And it shows you've been listening very carefully. Yes?
Drinks.
Drinks. Well, it could have been, but it wasn't either of those. They were leaflets. And guess what it said on those leaflets? Any ideas? Any guesses? Yes? A passport? Yeah, well, it could have been a passport, you could have been right. But the leaflets said that the Nazis were very bad people, and that people should work against the Nazis. They were anti-Nazi leaflets. And the next person in the crowd was a Nazi in uniform, and normally she would have been arrested, and she would have been sent to prison, or she might even have been killed. But I've been told this story by a lady who lives in Amsterdam. She was a friend of my mum and dad, and this friend is still alive. And she tells me that my mum was a very pretty girl, and the Nazi in uniform just helped her put those anti-Nazi leaflets back in her little suitcase. So my mum was a very, very brave girl, as well as a pretty one. And she and my dad fell in love, and they wanted to get married. But that wasn't allowed in Germany when the Nazis were in power, because one of them was Jewish and the other was not. It was against the law for them to get married, and they wanted to get married. So they escaped. They escaped to Holland. And I was born in Holland, and then the Nazis started a war, and they invaded Holland and took the country over. And they started making all the same laws in Holland that they had made in Germany. And my daddy couldn't work as an architect anymore. He started making wooden toys. And I was 3 years old at this time. And my mummy took me down to the cellar where my daddy was making wooden toys. And I wanted to play with them. And I wasn't allowed, so I was very upset with my mummy and daddy for not letting me play with these beautiful toys. But of course he had to sell them so that we'd have something to eat and somewhere to live. And then my daddy disappeared. And my mummy wouldn't tell me where he was. What had happened was he hid from the Nazis. There was a farmer near Amsterdam airport who took him in and hid him from the Nazis. The farmer was a very, very brave man, because he could have been killed for doing that. And he protected a lot of other Jews. And in the end, that farmer was killed by the Nazis for doing that. He was a wonderful and brave man who saved a lot of lives of Jewish people who were in danger of being killed by the Nazis. And then my mummy stopped me from playing with other children in the street. Do any of you play with other children in the street? Yeah, you do. These days, it doesn't happen so much anymore, because streets now are much more dangerous than they were then. There are more cars and lorries and buses and so on. And we have television, so there's more reason to stay inside, and it can be quite dangerous outside for many people. But in those days, there was no television. So guess what we did? We played with other children in the street. And I wasn't allowed. Because my mum thought it was too dangerous for people to know that there was a little boy living there whose father was Jewish. Because then the Nazis might come for me. And then one day, on a dark November night, I saw my daddy for the last time. He came home from his hiding place. And what had happened? Well, my mum was going to have another baby. And my dad had come home from the farm where he was hidden to help my mummy get to the hospital to have a baby, and to take me to some friends, another architect and his wife, and they were going to look after me for a few days whilst my mummy was in hospital. And so my baby sister, called Erica, was born, and somebody in the hospital didn't wash their hands properly. My mummy got a serious infection. There wasn't any penicillin in those days, there weren't any antibiotics, and my mummy died. So there was my new baby sister, without a mummy. Her daddy had to hide to save his own life. And the couple that had taken me in for a few days, well, they were stuck with me. And they looked after me for 2 years, until that day when I was arrested, and when the man was also arrested, and I saw him from behind. And he was sent to a place called a concentration camp, where he was killed. And his wife got just his spectacles back. And when he and his wife were looking after me, they knew they were risking their lives because the Nazis had threatened to kill anybody who protected a Jew from being arrested. And that's what they'd done. So he was a very, very brave man. And he was killed by the Nazis for looking after me. My sister was taken in by another Dutch family. But she was also arrested. Can you imagine? My 1-year-old sister was arrested because the Nazis, who were very powerful, they had conquered lots of countries. And wherever they went, they took whatever they wanted. And they imprisoned people, they killed people, they were very powerful. But it wasn't enough for them. They wanted my 1-year-old baby sister. And she was arrested too. And my sister and Erica and I ended up in a big prison camp with barbed wire and soldiers with guns. And I was told not to go near the barbed wire or I would be shot dead. Terrible food, not a lot of it. And eventually my sister and I ended up packed into a train, not a passenger train, a cattle truck, a wooden truck for transporting cows and so on, with no room to sit. We were with a huge number of other people. We were just wedged up against each other. There was no food, no drink, and it wasn't a fast train. We were on that train, I think, I'm not sure, but I think for 3 and 4 days and nights. There was one bucket to use as a loo. It was absolutely terrible. And a man died right next to me. We ended up in a place, it was a town, and the Nazis were using it as a prison for some of the Jews. Most of the Jews went to places where they were simply killed. But we went to a place where some Jews were kept alive for a time. And although it was a terrible place, they didn't get round to killing us. And so my sister Erica and I survived. And if your teachers write to the National Union of Teachers or to the Holocaust Education Trust, you can get a booklet for each of you, free of charge, called Martin and Erica's Story. And that you can take it home and show it to your mum and dad. And that is about my sister Erica and myself. So, why am I telling you that story? I'm telling you this story because it sometimes happens that people come to hate a whole group of people and try to kill them. And we tell the story so that people should learn not to do that again. And if there's time, I'll tell you another story, but only if I get permission from the teachers. Thank you for listening.
Do you want permission now or do you want permission another time?
Well, do you want to hear the story? Yeah. Okay. Well, I was talking to my granddaughter's class about 2 weeks ago. Her name is Abby. And before I gave the talk, I said to her, Abby, do you want to help me? When I've finished, come to the front and tell everybody else what I did with you and your sister Isabel last April. And they live in London, and Isabel and Abigail came to see my wife and myself, and we live in Leicester. So they came from London to Leicester to see us. And we've got a big house, and we've got a huge garden, really huge. Unfortunately, there had been a fire at Kingshurst Zoo. And would you believe it, the bear enclosure had burnt down. And Kingshurst Zoo had nowhere to keep their bear. And because we have this huge garden, we decided to help and just give them a little space to keep their bear for a few weeks until they got the bear enclosure built again. And if they were very good, and provided they didn't go alone and didn't go too close, they could go to the back of the garden, around the corner, and see the bear. So off they went, Abigail and Isabel, hand in hand, walking to the end of the garden. And I was watching them, they looked lovely. And then I heard laughing. Because what do you think they found? They found a notice on the grass saying, April Fool. It was the 1st of April. Now what's that story got to do with what I told you earlier? What's the connection between a silly story about a bear and the story about what happened to me when I was little? And I'll tell you. You see, when you're little, you trust people. You even trust your deceiving old granddad. But you certainly trust your mum and dad. And it's just as well. Because when you're little, you have to learn an amazing lot of things. Maybe you don't realize it, but you have all done a lot of learning, which is absolutely amazing. You can all speak English. Now you imagine somebody foreign who's grown up trying to learn English. They take years to do it, and they don't do it well. They speak with an accent. If you learn it properly, you have to learn loads and loads of things. You have to learn to keep your hand out of the fire. If you argued about everything, you'd never learn to speak, because you'd be arguing about how to say the word, and you'd be trying to put your hand in the fire because you didn't believe your mum and dad. So small children have to be very trusting, because it's the only way you can learn all those enormous numbers of things that all of you, being very clever, have had to learn. Later on, when you're a teenager, you will not believe your mummy and daddy about everything. You'll think everything they say is wrong, probably. And when you're a grown-up, with luck, you might think some of the things they say are wrong and some of the things they say are right. You make your own judgment. But when you're little, you have to trust the people who teach you. But there are people who take advantage. And they will tell you things which are wrong. And there are people who will teach you to hate other people who you have never met. So it's possible for children to be taught to hate people in a way that is quite wrong by people taking advantage of the way you have to be when you're a child. And that's why that story about the bear has a relation to what I said earlier.